Earlier this year, I set up 50 nest boxes on the wildlife homestead to try to create nesting sites for over 20 different species. Now that the season's over, I wanted to share how well these boxes did at attracting wildlife. There were some successes, some failures, and some that confused me and landed probably somewhere in the middle, but it was easily the busiest nesting season I've had since moving here, and there's a lot to unpack. In the original video, I went into more detail about the different houses, but I'll quickly go over each one. For birds, I set up boxes for bluebirds, tree swallows, chickadees, nuthatches, kestrels, flickers, and barred owls. I put up ledges for robins, phoebes, and barn swallows, artificial cup nests for cliff swallows, and a large tower for chimney swifts. For the insects, I had nesting chambers for mason bees and leafcutter bees, as well as houses for bumblebees. And lastly, for the mammals, I made boxes for bats, flying squirrels, and fishers. Usually the first year with new boxes is the most unpredictable because it does take time for animals to both find them and get comfortable with this new thing in their environment. But the first arrivals in early spring were definitely the easiest ones to attract because these were the species that have nested here in previous years. American robins were the first ones to start building their nest. This is where they nested last year, and I was really happy to see they came back to the same spot. It was funny because she didn't start building right away. For 3 days she would show up at all hours, and it looked like she was envisioning exactly where her nest would go, maybe how big it would have to be, or how much grass and mud she'd have to use. A good design needs a good plan, and it's how she was able to go from this to this in just 5 days. On the same structure just a few feet away, eastern phoebes once again returned to their nest from last year. Unlike the robins, if they have an intact nest from the previous year that was successful, they'll just add more material and build on top of the existing one. This means they waste less time and energy gathering materials and can start nesting sooner. These phoebes got my hopes up a little bit because the camera that's inside the Swift tower right beside the garage sent me a bunch of videos one morning, and I thought that the swifts may have found the new tower, but it was the phoebes going in and out. Unfortunately, that was the only activity we had in the tower all season. Honestly, I didn't have high expectations for this structure, considering I've never seen chimney swifts here. But next year I'll set up a speaker to play swift calls during the spring migration, and that can sometimes help them find these new nest sites. With both the phoebes and the robins nesting side by side, it's interesting how both families had completely different seasons. I've been doing nest surveys for almost 10 years, and one thing I've learned is that when it comes to phoebes, it seems like there's almost always something that goes wrong. I've seen predators raiding the nest, the young getting outcompeted by parasitic cowbirds, and even chicks falling out prematurely. And this year was no exception. Sadly, they did have a failed nest, but I wasn't sure at first how it failed. It took a little bit of digging to figure out what happened. While I was checking videos of the different nests, I noticed that one of the phoebe chicks didn't make it. And this isn't out of the ordinary. With most songbirds, it's always a toss-up whether the weakest chick will survive. But after a couple of days, I realized I hadn't received any videos from the phoebe nest, which was unusual. When I checked on it, the rest of the chicks were gone. It was too early for them to have fledged, so my first thought was a predator. But that didn't make much sense because I can't see how they could have gotten up here, taken the 3 remaining chicks, all without triggering the camera. It wasn't until I cycled through all the footage that I realized what likely happened. This is what the nest looked like when she started laying eggs. If you focus on that right side, you'll see as the season progresses, it deteriorates more and more, until we get to the day right before the chicks disappeared. This was a pretty big gap in the nest, and phoebe chicks are known to push each other around and lean against one another, so the nest likely gave out and they fell to the ground. If you watched my last video, you may have seen we've had the fox family hanging around our garage, and there's no way they would have passed up an easy meal like this. Another reason I don't think it was a predator was because the robins were nesting a few feet away and had zero problems all season. They had a clutch of 4 chicks, which is one more than they had last year, and each of them were healthy and successfully fledged in the same afternoon. The next wave of migrants that started their nesting season were the tree swallows, the kestrels, and the flickers. Last year I noticed it was a little tight in the standard size swallow boxes that I decided to experiment with larger ones. The original floor size was 4 by 5.5 inches and the new ones were roughly 6 by 6. Our property is mostly forested, so we're limited with how many tree swallow pairs we can attract, but we managed to get 2 pairs. Sure enough, both pairs nested in these bigger boxes. For the 3rd consecutive year, our tree swallows have had big clutches and all the young fledged successfully. On the other hand, things didn't go as smoothly with the kestrels and flickers. Both would have been new species nesting on the wildlife homestead, and early on it was looking very promising. Not even 24 hours after setting up my kestrel boxes, I was shocked to see one perched right beside them in a nearby spruce. This one stayed for a few days, and it was the earliest we've ever had them on the property. Usually they only show up in late summer when they're starting their migration, so this was a really good sign. I also saw that the flickers were hanging out more in our yard, and I eventually found them removing all the shavings from one of the log houses. But that's when the European starling showed up. They chased off the kestrels, then they chased off the flickers, so sadly I had to board up the larger boxes with scrap wood. I was hoping with no available nest sites they'd move on, and they actually did for a few days. The flickers were able to come back and spent the morning excavating another box. But were once again chased off by the starlings. The frustrating thing is that starlings don't even excavate their own cavities, and this one forced out the flicker before it was even done removing the shavings, so the starlings can't even use this box. This is the first year that I have openings big enough for starlings, and I'm seeing that they'll likely be a problem every year. Thankfully, they can't get into the 1.5-inch entrance holes of the swallow and bluebird houses, so I only have to think of ways to keep them out of the larger ones. I'm not exactly sure what happened to the flickers, but the kestrels still found a snag to nest in a few properties down the road, and after the young fledged in mid-July, the family spent a couple of weeks around our house. I think this is a good lesson. When you build a structure or a habitat for a specific species, the odds are something completely different will find a use for it. Early in the spring, most of the structures I put up weren't even used for nesting. They were used by sapsuckers to amplify their drumming sound during the mating season. The louder they drum, the more their sound carries through the forest, warning rivals to stay clear and advertising their presence to potential mates. But when searching for nest sites, some sapsuckers got a little too excited. Oh gosh, well, this didn't last too long. The bat boxes that I built to have fewer ventilation slots in hopes of them getting warmer in the summer are now filled with sapsucker holes not even 2 weeks later. I have no clue if the bats are actually going to use these anymore. They'll definitely retain less heat, but I guess we'll have to wait and see if they'll use them. In the end, this wasn't really a big deal, considering I went from having 1 bat sighting in 2024 to 0 sightings this year, so it's not like we had a bunch of bats around that couldn't use these houses. I will say that it probably doesn't help our chances at attracting bats when we've had this pair of barred owls hanging around all spring. Although it's rare, they can hunt bats, and considering the boxes are right beside our ponds, which is where the owls come to hunt, there is a small possibility they can deter them. But hey, having barred owls is a good consolation prize, and this has been the best year for sightings. I thought the owls were coming to hunt frogs, but I was surprised to see that the majority of the time they would hunt large beetles. Bear with me, the footage I got was really bad. It was dark and I didn't have my tripod, but you can see how they catch them out of midair. Unfortunately, this pair didn't use any of my boxes, but they were coming around so often that I set up another one right behind the trout pond. Even though they wouldn't have used it this year, I always like getting them out early because it gives them a little bit more time to find it before the winter. Now going from our largest entrance hole to our smallest, the mason bee and leafcutter bee trays were one of my favorites to watch this year. Mason bees are our spring bees and leafcutters are our summer bees. Right on time in mid-May, there were mason bees that started laying eggs in here. They create a cell with clay, lay an egg, and deposit a hefty dose of pollen in every cell. Throughout the spring, there were only 3 or 4 mason bees visiting these chambers, and they laid a total of 40 eggs. This is the start of the population, so I'm hoping that number will increase every year. By the time summer rolled around, I kept checking to see if the leafcutter bees would show up, but they never did. What we got instead were lobed mason wasps. Similar to the mason bee, they bring mouthfuls of mud into their nesting chambers, shaping it carefully into a series of cells. After a cell is created, the female lays an egg, but instead of filling it with pollen, she stocks it with something a little bigger: caterpillars. I find it remarkable that they're able to paralyze caterpillars and actually fly with them when they're around the same size or even heavier than they are. Pound for pound, I can't think of many flying animals that can do that. When the egg hatches, the larva will have a handful of protein-packed caterpillars to feed on while they develop, and eventually they'll emerge as a new adult wasp. Except, not all of these cells will produce a lobed mason wasp, because while she's been building, she's also been watched by the cuckoo wasp. This colorful iridescent wasp is a parasitoid. It sneaks into the nests of other species and lays its own eggs inside their cells. When the cuckoo wasp larva hatches, it consumes both the host larva as well as the stored caterpillars. For the cuckoo wasp, timing and stealth are everything. If it gets caught in or around the chamber, the mason wasp will attack. I started paying attention to how long the mason wasp would be away from her nest. When she left to gather mud, she was back within 30 to 90 seconds. But when she went out to hunt caterpillars, she disappeared for 2 to 5 minutes, and once it was almost 10. So it's much safer for the cuckoo wasp to wait for that longer window. But how does it know when to make its move? Well, this one was waiting for a very specific cue. The mason wasp always backs into the nest right before laying an egg. Once she does that and flies off again, the next step in her routine is to go hunt. That's the moment the cuckoo wasp has been waiting for. As soon as the mason leaves, she slips inside to lay her own egg. So in the end, this cell still produced a wasp, just not the one that built it. Overall, I'd call these trays a partial success. We got one of our 2 target species and added a couple others that I wasn't expecting. But when it came to our bumblebee houses, those ones were way more successful than I thought they'd be. I had read that it could be difficult to get bumblebees to use new boxes, and some studies reported pretty low occupancy rates. So when I built 8 of them, I used different materials and designs to increase my chances. My goal was to get one of them occupied, and to my surprise, there were 4 that ended up being used by the same species, the confusing bumblebee Bombus perplexus. I had numbered each box, and the ones that were occupied were numbers 1, 2, 4, and 7. There weren't any characteristics that were unanimously favored by the bumblebees, but 3 of the 4 successful nests had a 3/4 inch entrance hole, the other one had a 1-inch hole, and 3 of the 4 had rabbit fur as the insulation instead of cattail seed heads. Because bumblebees naturally prefer old mouse nests, I tried filling the boxes with similar materials. Rabbit fur is about the closest I can get to mouse fur, so we save some from our rabbit every time she sheds. We don't use any products on her, so it was safe to add to the boxes, and I honestly think without her fur, they wouldn't have been as successful. Another element that I think helped in their success was setting them up directly beside the wildflower meadows, especially beside the patches of violets, which give them a vital food source in early spring. Since it's a rare habitat out in our area, I've been working every year to expand and diversify our meadows. If I just let everything turn to forest, we'd lose many amazing species that visit the homestead, one of which would be the eastern bluebirds. Like the tree swallows, the bluebirds also chose one of the new larger boxes. I like to watch what materials the birds are bringing into their nests and make small piles for them nearby. Our bluebirds mostly use dead pine needles and dried grasses, so I started by collecting those. I guess I was being watched while I was making these piles because 2 pairs of cedar waxwings started gathering grasses for their own nests. These waxwings would soon find out that their nest placement was in one of the worst possible spots because the tall pines are filled with red squirrels. So although they built here, neither pair actually laid eggs. The bluebirds were much safer. Their nest box was far enough away from the pines, and a predator guard stops any squirrels from climbing up, so all of their young successfully fledged in early summer. One of the latest nesting birds to return to our property is the cliff swallow. I ordered artificial cliff swallow nests from Swallow Conservation and set them up about 20 feet high. When the cliff swallows arrived in early July, I had a good laugh because obviously the one year where I buy nests is the year where they decide to build one of their own. I like to think that the artificial nest maybe encouraged them that this was a good nesting site, but they seem to really like that spot under the eave of the roof, so next year I'll buy a tall enough ladder so I can get some artificial nests up there. Cliff swallows typically build these gourd-shaped nests. The weird thing was, this pair only built half a nest before the female started sitting on eggs. I'm not sure if their mud source dried up or if it was getting too late in the season, but I had never seen this before and I've had trouble finding any research that talks about this. The female sat up there for almost 2 weeks until one morning I saw another cliff swallow pair harass her and pull out the grass from the nest. After this, she never returned. A month later, I attached a camera to a pole to see if she was actually sitting on eggs, and sure enough, there was one with a crack in it, which may have happened during the attack. This just shows, for better or for worse, there's never a dull moment during the nesting season. I waited as long as I could before checking the cameras at the flying squirrel and the fisher houses. Both of these are more targeted for winter use, so I didn't have high hopes that anything would use them yet. Funny enough, the only fisher sighting was one checking out the flying squirrel box, and the only flying squirrel was at the fisher box. The flying squirrel visited 12 different times, so it's looking good, but we'll still have to wait and see if they actually use it. There's a few species that I still haven't mentioned, like the black-capped chickadees and the red-breasted nuthatches. We have enough smaller snags on the property that they were able to excavate their own nests. But that's what the nesting season is all about. I try to learn a little each year, and after seeing what worked and what didn't, I make adjustments and build even more houses for the upcoming season. The nice thing about setting up all of these boxes is every spring is a fresh start. Next year will be filled with new nests, new stories, and new surprises here on the Wildlife Homestead.